Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat, and my brother John is over on the other side of the screen. You can't see him, but say hello, John.
Hello, John.
You didn't have to get that close to the mic, man.
Yes, I did.
Okay. So, we are co-hosts of this thing that we just call This Is Not Church. And, you know, for those of you who've been listening for a while, you understand the purpose of the title of the show. We mean that very much tongue in cheek. We feel like what happens here an awful lot of times is church. We're just having conversations, trying to connect with folks and talk about things that interest us. And what else is church other than that? Everything else is ceremony, I think. And so with us today, though, we're super excited. You've probably gotten tired of hearing me say that, too, because we've just had a run of really, really amazing people, John.
Yeah, we have.
We just had John Dominic Crossan on not too long ago. And, you know, and we just keep reaching for the stars and they keep responding. And so today we have one of my heroes. I hesitate to use that word because I know he won't like it, but somebody whose work I've followed a bunch and someone whose voice I think is just very, very important for how we envision faith in the 21st century. And so today we have with us Brian McLaren. And if you know and are familiar with his work, then you're probably as excited as we are to hear what he has to say today. If you're not familiar, man, you're in for a treat because there's so much good stuff to go back and check into and dive into. But let me read you just a little tiny bit about him and we will barely scratch the surface. And then we'll jump into talking about his new book and whatever else decides to happen. So Brian McLaren is an author, speaker, an activist, and a public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, he's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a faculty member of the Living School and podcaster with Learning How to See, which are part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. That's Richard Rohr's outfit, right?
That's right.
He is also an Auburn Senior Fellow and a co-host of Southern Lights. His newest book, and this is a little bit dated, I can tell I'm reading this. Your newest book is not After Doubt. Your newest book is actually Do I Stay Christian, which is a follow-up to that one, if I understand correctly. And I've got it on my desk right here. And then he has recent projects that also include a children's book for all ages called Corey and the Seventh Story and the Galapagos Islands, A Spiritual Journey. I'm going to stop there because the rest just goes into biography and we can cover that to whatever degree that you want to. We're really here to talk today, first and foremost, about your new book, Do I Stay Christian? And again, whatever else just happens to happen. So welcome to the show, Mr. McLaren. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm so glad to be with you guys. I'm doing great and happy to be here.
That's amazing. It's amazing because as soon as we actually were able to book an interview with you, our friends over at the Heretic Happy Hour reached out to us immediately and said, "Hey, how did you get Brian McLaren?" I said, "Well, none of your business. I'm not going to hook you up." So, of course, I reluctantly gave them the contact information. And they booked you before we did. I'm like, wait a minute. What the heck is going on? But so I know you've talked to those guys over there. You seem like you've been making the rounds on the podcast circuit, which is amazing, promoting your new book. But before we get to talk about that, if you wouldn't mind, we ask this of all of our guests. And if you're game, maybe just give us a brief overview of kind of your spiritual journey.
Yeah.
How you've gotten to where you are today.
Sure. So I grew up in this really conservative little fundamentalist sect made up of so many wonderful, good, caring people called the Plymouth Brethren. I don't know if you ever heard of them.
Yeah.
Garrison Keillor was Plymouth Brethren, and some people would know Jim Wallace. Anyway, at a pretty young age, I felt like this isn't going to work for me. I'm on my way out of here. And then my teenage years, I ended up having this very kind of deep spiritual experience. So I ended up staying Christian, but it's not been a super comfortable fit in many ways for me. And so I've been writing about, and I should say I started my career as a college English teacher, but I ended up leaving teaching and became a pastor for 24 years. But I've really been writing about the struggles so many of us have with our religious identity. And just about everything I've written connects with that struggle of religious identity.
That's amazing. So the first book that I actually recall reading of yours almost got me fired, which I now tell is a wonderful little anecdote. I was on staff at a very conservative church here in Texas, and somebody gave me a copy of A Generous Orthodoxy. And I ate it up. I devoured it. It was everything that I had been sensing. You know what I mean? You read those books, sometimes you go, everything I had sensed in my heart and just didn't have vocabulary even to articulate it. And all of a sudden you were there saying all these things. And so I in my naivete And in my zeal, I gave that to my pastor. I said, man, you got to read this book. It's amazing. And he's like, okay. And he stuck it on his desk. And about a week or two later, he came back and sort of tossed the book back at me and said something to the effect of, if this is the kind of crap you're reading, maybe we should discuss your employment here.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
You know, again, I sort of was, shell-shocked a little bit. I thought everything in that book was pretty nifty, man. There was some really good questions asked. But it started me on the road to, you know, what in modern terms today, I guess, for lack of a better term, we've been throwing this word deconstruction around quite a bit. I've written about it. John's writing about it. We've done some things. But I wanted to start from the beginning because you've been identified with, connected to the so-called emergent church movement that I'm guessing started back in the late 80s, early 90s. People like Phyllis Tickle and others like that. First of all, is that a term you still think is appropriate? Is it one you even appropriated for yourself, or was it something that people called you?
Yeah,
and has maybe that morphed a little bit?
Yeah, interesting question. Now, those of us who were involved, we sort of found each other. We all were asking these questions and struggling with these things, and we found out, oh gosh, I'm not the only one. There's these other people. We found each other, and the word that I always preferred was, we used the term emergent conversation. We chose the word emergent because we felt like something was emerging. Yeah, we felt like it wasn't fully emerged; it was still in process, and I still feel that today. But we didn't use the word movement in those days because I had a pretty high bar for what constituted a movement, but we talked about it as a conversation. And so, and that was the late 90s where that started to come together. And it's a term that some people still use. I personally think that it hasn't outlived its usefulness, because I still think the ways that we defined it, that we felt something was emerging out of modern Christianity, but it had a long way to go before it was fully emerged. That I think that process is still ongoing. Not too many people use the term anymore, but I still think it's apropos. Yeah, no, it's definitely a term I don't hear much anymore, especially from, you know, the younger folks. But what you said rings kind of true. It feels the same as what's happening now. Right. And I think maybe that's just the way movements happen anyway. Yeah. But actually, I think it relates to the story you told a minute ago, because I think enough pastors threatened enough people that they either had to leave or stop talking that way. Yeah. So, well, and when you do find somebody who has any even remotely similar questions, don't you just glom onto them like immediately? Like there's this instant camaraderie whenever even today, you know, I meet somebody who, there's a guy in my town who has posted quotes from authors I know are not mainstream. And I'm all of a sudden I'm calling him. Like, there's somebody else in my town who's reading this guy. We need to talk. Like, we need to hang out. So I'm always looking for some kind of connection. But it seems like you're always looking for someone, like you said, to sort of validate, I'm not the only one thinking this. Like, I'm not the only crazy one. That conversation with that pastor where he tongue-in-cheek threatened to fire me, first of all, I'm not sure it was that tongue-in-cheek, but it did push me towards a precipice with that church. I knew my time was short with them. Yes. It didn't really touch my faith. It didn't really make me question my belief in God, but it certainly made me question career choices. And so, you know, and fast forward, you know, this was like 2007, 2008. So, I just sense that the emergent church, to me, it feels like it morphed into this, what is now happening in this deconstruction thing. And because I feel like that same sensibility is happening. Where absolutely. Really, and hopefully the people who are doing the deconstruction work the best. The people that I'm paying attention to are the ones who are saying, listen, this is a process. It's going to be an ongoing process. That's right. And I'll tell you the truth. What we did through a lot of in-person gatherings, I think is happening now in podcasts, exactly like this one. So the process is continuing. It's popping up it's emerging in new, different ways. Yeah. There you go. Well, maybe it's just time to come back around to that because I like the emerging, not the emergent. And that was always what I had. There was a tension that seemed like between those two words, even though it seems like on one hand, like you're like, okay, I'm just splitting hairs. But no, one to me connotes this constant change. Like we're never going to fully arrive at some place where we go, okay, now we've landed, we know everything. So emerging to me sounds much better, but that's what it feels like we're doing with deconstruction as well. And again, most people that I'm paying attention to are not coming anywhere near to saying,
oh, and now we figured this out.
Exactly. Yeah.
And now, they're the ones saying, no, this is going to be something we do for quite a while. Also, before I forget to mention, I noticed in your bio that you are a graduate of my alma mater, the University of Maryland. So
is that so? Fantastic.
Yeah. So that's a little point of contact for us. I actually first was introduced to John Dominic Crossan at University of Maryland.
Is that so?
When I was still a dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist and hated his guts. So.
Yes. Well, having grown up fundamentalist, I would have despised John Dom too. But I have to say, I got to meet him and speak with him at a conference a few years ago, and he is just one of the sweetest human beings anybody will ever meet. Oh my goodness, what a good human!
What struck me about him, and this isn't a podcast about him, but we'll talk about him anyway for a second. But I love to meet a guy who's in his 80s, who man, he is up on everything.
Yes,
like he's talking about his TikTok and his Instagram, and he's talking. I mean, and there's not a subject matter that's off limits for him. He knew about everything, and just a delightful, just a lighthearted, funny guy. I was not expecting him to be so funny. And just that neat Irish wit,
That's right.
Anyway, let's before we gush more about Dom, so let's talk about the book. Do I Stay Christian? I think the title on the one hand is self-explanatory, but I bet there's stuff in there that people might not expect. Walk us through what you're trying to say with this book.
Well, some people might expect that this is a book that tries to convince people to stay Christian, kind of like, oh, you're having doubts about staying Christian? Let me prove to you why you're stuck and you have to stay Christian, that's just what people need. No, because so many people are struggling with Christian identity, and because some people certainly will leave Christianity. There's just no doubt about it. That's happening. I don't know the current number, but a couple of years ago, 75 million people, 75 million American adults grew up going to church and have since dropped out. So a lot of people are finding really important reasons to leave. And so what I try to do in the book is the first third of the book is just called No. And I try to give the 10 really legitimate reasons to leave Christianity. I'll be honest, any one of these I think is a good enough reason to leave. Put all 10 together, and I'm surprised as many of us are staying as are. And what especially I think is troubling is that a lot of people, the people who've read the book so far have said to me, one of the things that shocked them is just that how few people know any of this stuff about our history and about the present even as well. But I think it's possible. In fact, I think you'll be a better Christian if you face those first 10 reasons and you decide to stay. I think it's possible to stay. And so the second part of the book is called Yes. I talk about 10 reasons to stay Christian, even with your eyes wide open about the 10 reasons not to stay. And then at the end of the second part of the book, I basically say, look, some of us are going to stay Christian, some of us aren't. But either way, tomorrow we've got to wake up and ask the question, how are we going to live? What kind of human beings do we want to be? And that's the third part of the book. So the three parts are no, yes, and how.
Okay. And then the no section is compelling, by the way. When I read the title, I read it from the perspective of somebody who has struggled with staying Christian.
Yeah.
And so that to me sounded more like do I? Should I? Not so much. So I really think that's why I like the title so much. I think depending on where you are in your life, you might read that a little differently and put your own sort of inflections on it and say, for me, it's been a struggle. I know John, not so much. He's made his decision and he's departed, although he hasn't managed to leave Jesus behind. So I think that's the bigger question is some will read that title. If you're ensconced inside of some sort of fundamentalist understanding of Christianity, you would say to leave Christianity is to leave Jesus. And I would argue that sometimes the best way to stay faithful to Jesus is to leave this institution we've called Christianity and find more authentic expressions.
I wonder if I could just say something to folks who might feel that way, because
Absolutely.
A lot of the folks who might say that, would be Baptist or Pentecostal or whatever. And the thing that I think is worth remembering is that every Christian in the West was Roman Catholic until the 16th century.
Yeah.
Every single Christian in the West virtually was Roman Catholic. And they did not give you permission to be something other than a Catholic Christian. So for them, for you to say that you're going to be a Christian and not Catholic, they would say that's impossible. That can't happen. You leave the church and you're outside. So it might just help Baptists and Pentecostals and Bible church people and others to understand that there's a whole lot of us right now who are saying about them what their ancestors said about Roman Catholicism. And, and that might help them understand a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah, I think you're right. And because having grown up in that tradition, John and I did, and I'll turn this over to John in a second. I just won't stomp all over your words, John. But a lot of us grew up with the understanding that our understanding and our particular brand of faith was the one. And so it was difficult to see. And I was raised in a very anti-Catholic community. There just wasn't much love for the Catholic Church at all. And it was pretty much, we sent missionaries to countries where they were predominantly Catholic so we could convert those evil papists back to the true faith. And so, right? I just thought all Catholics prayed to the Pope and, did all kinds of crazy stuff and sacrificed their kids. No, we didn't think that, but even on a more focused level, even if you weren't our particular brand of Protestant, we weren't sure. And so
that's how I grew up too.
Such a narrow-minded view, right? Your book might have been the first place I read the word ecumenical, and if you use the word, if you didn't, you certainly expressed an ecumenical view of the world. And then the same pastor that tried to fire me, or threatened to fire me, I should say, sent me on a spiritual retreat called the Walk to Emmaus, which is a very ecumenical 72-hour retreat that we actually had at a Catholic retreat center, but it was, there was nothing denominational about it except that the people that actually owned the course was the Methodist Church. But other than that, there was nothing. And so that was actually his undoing, was insisting that I go on this thing. And 4 days later, walking out going, man, my view of Christianity was extremely narrow. Like I just had no idea that there were all these other people doing this thing so differently. So that was, for me, an ecumenical approach has been something I've been striving for ever since, trying to get rid of some of these denominational boundaries and lines. But,
this whole idea of, that if you leave Christianity, you leave Jesus behind. So the question I ask people when they kind of throw that at me is like, okay, so you're no longer a Christian, or you no longer call yourself a Christian. Do you believe in Jesus? And it's like, well, my question to them would be, would you be willing to follow a man if you took away all of the miracles, all of these things that you couldn't prove that did or didn't happen, and you just went with the words of this historical figure and said, I want to follow that guy? Is there still enough there for you? And for me, the answer is yes. That I can drop all the miracles. I can drop, was he resurrected? Was he born of a virgin birth? All of that. If I dump all of that, what is left of Jesus is enough right now.
Yeah. Actually, can I tell you something about that? That strikes me as really kind of cool, is how it resonates with something that Jesus said. I think it's in the Gospel of John, but he says, look, believe in me because of what I say. And if you can't do that, then believe in me because of the miracles. In other words, like the real point of this is not the miracles. The real point of this is what I say. And what we have done, the version of Christianity I inherited was very uninterested in Jesus as a teacher, right? And was really just interested in him getting born of a virgin and dying and resurrecting. And you could leave out all the teaching, that was unimportant.
Yeah. And I think it was Richard Rohr that I read first. I mean, he's got a quote, something to the effect of that you could essentially follow Jesus that way and still be a despicable person. Like you right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to transform you into a good human being. And Richard would have said it way more eloquently than that. But essentially, that's what we've done as a church for so long is exactly what you said. We focused in on believing the right things about Jesus. That was really of paramount importance, right? Make sure you believe the right things. And we would get sideways with other Christian groups or even people that we would say were cultish, because they would deny the divinity of Christ. Okay, so never mind everything else that they had done, that was more Christ-like than a lot of the stuff we were doing. They didn't believe the right things about that guy, right?
I also agree with what you said earlier about all these chapters. The first chapter's in the no section. Any one of these individually you're absolutely correct, is a valid reason to leave the Christian faith. And then once you put these all together, it does beg the question, right? Why would I stay? Why would I want to stay in this? And I think for someone like my brother, I think the reason he stays is because he feels like someone has to be a voice from the inside saying all this BS has to stop. This isn't what the original good news was. And we've gone so far afield from what it is to be Christ-like that we don't even understand that word anymore. I can see why someone like my brother wants to stay in there and fight, which is not a very good word for someone who's trying to be more passive and understanding of the need of removing violence. But to say that this can change. But this question actually would be to either one of you, my brother or you. Do you see this as a long term, or do you see that we could see a change in our lifetime, or do you think this is we're just the beginning of potentially bringing some kind of change towards a Christian church that would be more Christ-like?
Do you want to respond to that first, Matt?
Yeah, 2 words: long term.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think long term is probably the only time frame to think about. But here's the other thing I'd say. Here's what I see happening at this moment, and what I expect to continue to see. I expect the worst part to get way worse, and I think it'll get worse fast. I think we're about to see things get uglier than they've been in a long time. I don't think we're anywhere close to the bottom. I think January 6th was a sort of a picture of where a certain kind of desperate Christian faith fused with political assumptions and agendas, inflamed by authoritarian leaders who have an incredible and mass media that empower lies even more effectively than they empower the truth. So that's one side. But I think while things are getting worse, I think things will be getting better at the same time. In other words, I think there will be parts of the Christian faith that will be getting better. And one of the reasons this is easy for me to believe, or possible for me to believe, is in the last 20 years, I've gotten deeply involved in a lot of interfaith communities. And I see this happening, like some of the deepest and most powerful expressions of Judaism are happening now. And some of the ugliest expressions of Judaism are happening now. And some of the deepest expressions of Islam are happening now. And some of the most ugly. And in fact, it just seems to be happening not just in religion, but what does it mean to be an American? We see some of the most beautiful expressions of that and some of the ugliest expressions. So I think in some weird way, both the good and the bad are accelerating right now.
I'm not sure if this is a good analogy, but it feels like almost like these things have been put into a centrifuge,
Yeah.
And all of the extremes are being pushed out to the outside, right? And what I see happening, I think you're 100% right, by the way. I think January 6th was just the beginning. If anyone thinks that, really ultra conservative evangelicals are gonna stop now that they're on the cusp of overturning Roe v. Wade, man, they're gonna double, triple, quadruple down in 2024. 2022 is gonna be bad enough. November is gonna be bad. I think 2024, if they manage to wrangle Trump to come back in and run again, I think we've only just seen the beginning, because now they're emboldened, right? Their agenda has worked. They've managed to stack the courts. They're managing now, and they're not going to stop at Roe v. Wade. I mean, they're going to come after gay marriage. They're going to come after every little thing that they think is chipped away at their hegemony and made them, in their own estimation, have minimized them somewhat or marginalized. It's so interesting because me as a middle-aged white male can play the victim card as well as anybody else now. I've been given all the tools to act like I have somehow been attacked, and I'm the most privileged victim in history. It's absolutely mind-boggling. But don't you see that kind of happen like that? I feel like that's actually beginning to kind of swell now. Once this ruling from the court becomes official, if it does in fact become official, I only expect the chest pounding to intensify. I would wonder if that's historically a pattern we could see. You know what I mean? Like as we move towards something larger shifting in the culture, do we see this polarization first? Do we begin to see things begin to come apart at the seams before we can see something that emerges out of that is different than both? And we may just have to try and find a way to reject both extremes and find a way out through the middle. I don't know. That's just a curiosity for the historians.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I think we have the blessing or the curse of living in a very interesting time. I think it's going to be a lot of drama, and I think all of us are going to have to learn how to keep our heads, because if we panic at every turn, we'll be exhausted really fast, and we're going to need ways to keep some center and
keep
frankly,
our heads about us.
Yeah, and frankly, I think what you guys are doing with podcasts, in a way, we're giving people a chance to hear a sustained conversation, and it's not just people yelling at each other and going from one soundbite to another. You know, isn't it interesting how podcasts, in a sense, offer a different space? And you guys being two brothers who obviously love each other and don't agree on everything, and that in itself is a beautiful thing that's happening right now, I think.
Yeah, it's podcasting is something. So John actually dragged me into this whole thing, kicking and screaming. This was all his idea. I just agreed to come along for the ride. And so, to be honest with you, before we started recording our own podcast, I had listened to a handful. It wasn't really. I just wasn't a big podcast guy. And so, and all of a sudden, I'm exactly seeing what you're describing, which is this really interesting space for what have turned into more prolonged conversations. I love that there's typically not. It's just not that soundbite culture where you're looking for a gotcha moment. You're not looking for that. We've had people on the show with whom we are absolutely in sync, and we love everything they have to say. And we've had people on that we disagree. And but those conversations have always managed to be civil, and we're able to push back a little bit and challenge each other. And I think that's really important. Let's talk about this though before we move on though. So in terms of Christianity's history, I know that one thing that you talk about is the sort of concept of colonialism within Christianity. For those of our people who are listening who might not know that term, at least in terms of associating with Christian faith, talk to us about that. What is this colonial or post-colonial?
Yeah, so almost all of us, I'm really glad you asked that, because something I try to tell the story of every chance I get is the origins of colonialism. So everybody knows 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I think more people need to know 1452 when Pope Nicholas told the European kings what to do. And he sent out a series of letters, first to the King of Portugal and then to the King of France and Italy and Spain. And in this letter, I quote part of it in the book. People can find it. But if they want to look it up online, all that you have to do is Google Doctrine of Discovery. And that's the name for a series of letters written by first Pope Nicholas and then a succeeding pope. And basically they say to the kings of Europe, go into all the world and make slaves of all nations. And they give permission for the kings of Europe to go into all the world and enslave everybody and take their wealth. Now, I'm being very cynical here, but I think it's honest. I think what Pope Nicholas was doing, he needed money. He needed money for the Vatican, and he needed money to help fuel a war that he was fighting on several different fronts with Muslims, which, by the way, is part of the history that most Christians don't know. That is the backstory to why there's animosity between Christians and Muslims. This goes back, to the 1400s and before. If you read this letter, it's relatively short. It is absolutely chilling to see what was happening. And that's what happened. So Columbus and others went out and they made slaves. They enslaved people and they stole their wealth. They brought that wealth back to Europe, and that made Europe become the center of the world for the last 500 years. And what Christians don't realize, and even if you're Protestant, one way to describe the Protestant Reformation is that the King of England and the leaders of Germany and Netherlands and other Northern European countries, by breaking away from the Vatican, they had permission now to colonize the world, but they didn't have to give a cut of the proceeds to the Pope. They got to keep all the profits for themselves. And so this thing that was unleashed by the Christian church had incredible consequences for every single human being on the planet. And those consequences continue until today. And the world was changed by a religious document in the 1450s.
But we see the same mindset at play then, don't we? Even on a on a smaller scale. Right. We have Christian denominations who see their role in the world as being invasive.
Yes.
Like we're supposed to go into all the world. Now, I know. So does this go back to it? And how is this different? Anyway, I guess even from the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. He didn't say make slaves of all nations, but even to go in under one understanding and make disciples of all nations sounds like a colonial approach on some level.
It really could, except that tells you how deeply it tells you how deeply the Christian faith has been colonized. In other words, it's been turned into a colonial faith because interestingly, what we change this statement to is go into all the world and make Christians of all nations.
Right.
In other words, make them submit to Christianity and bring them into our control and orbit. Whereas, disciple is a learner or student. So if what Jesus is saying is, look, I've gone around teaching people to love each other, to be nonviolent, to forgive, to reconcile, to treat your neighbor as you would be treated, to even love your enemy. Teach everybody around the world how to do this. That's not a bad idea, actually. But that's not what ended up happening. This is very personal to me. My dad grew up in Africa because his father was a missionary from Scotland to Angola. And I won't go into the whole story. I tell this story in my book, Great Spiritual Migration. But my grandfather didn't realize the degree to which the missionary work he was doing was a real ally of colonialism. And I won't tell that story now, but it's very personal to me. And one of the courageous things my father had to do, his father pressured him to be a missionary, and my father didn't want to be a missionary. He didn't want to be part of that, in part because what he saw, how that was lived out. Yeah,
and John's and my experience, we both grew up I grew up in a Foursquare church mostly.
Yes.
And so sort of Pentecostal light, if you want to call it that, but also, my mom and dad came to know Jesus in the 70s in the Jesus movement. So we're children of that culture, but it was very, very much a big part of our lives to send missionaries. And several of my friends have gone on to be full-time missionaries in their lives. And I know the heart of those people. I think the vast majority of those people go into this with the best of intentions.
Yes.
I really do believe. I don't question their motives, but I think there's been a lot of people pulling back from that model of missionary work, saying, well, at least beginning to recognize what they've done, which is wreaking havoc on the local cultures, pretty much minimalizing or belittling everything they believe. We talked to one guy who was, basically saying that we've gone to other cultures and basically stripped them of their ancestors, taken away all this stuff that's been generationally important to them, and colonized them. But that's been the story of the church, and there are expressions of the church today who see this that way more explicitly than that. They would not shy away from that term. They would say, absolutely, we're doing that. We're taking over we're taking over the schools. We're taking over the local government. We're taking over, that sort of seven mountain dominion theology that says we got to take over Hollywood. And so the effects of that, though, I think are chilling, don't you? I see the effects of that as being. So what are some of those things that you see that are tangible negative effects of that happening even in the United States?
Well, I think about, this is several years ago now when I was still a pastor, and my next door neighbor was Jewish, and I was running out the front door to a meeting, And she calls me as I'm running to my car. I was running late. And she says, "Hey, Brian, do you have a minute?" I said, "I just have a minute." She walks over and she says, "I spent the morning listening to Christian radio." And then she said, not for inspiration, but for surveillance purposes. And she said, "Every preacher I heard said, 'We're going to take this country back for Jesus.'" And she said, "Can you tell me what that means?" She said, "Are they telling me as a Jewish mother that I'd better move my children to Canada?" Because she heard it really and when she said that to me, I realized she hears them saying, "We're going to make this like a Christian theocratic nation in which Jewish people will have to live as second-class citizens if they're safe at all." And frankly, there's a lot of people, that's what they want. That's what they want.
Yeah, that was something that Dom brought up because his new book, Render Unto Caesar, deals with, the sort of Rome in its rise of autocracy as it's going into its final decline. The symptom of that final decline was the loss of their republic, and they're moving towards this autocracy and this really violent expression of empire. But he made this comment in our podcast with him. He's like, most people liked it.
Yes.
Unless you were on the receiving end of the brutality, this worked for you. And so that's what I see in the United States, because I don't think you can miss the parallels. There's a segment of the population that absolutely would welcome and embrace an autocrat if they were their autocrat.
Exactly.
Right? They weren't the ones on the receiving end of that brutality. But I look at my gay friends, my transgender friends. I look at people who are, otherwise living on sort of the margins of our society. And they're the ones who are shaking. They're scared, and rightfully so, because once the gloves come off, we've seen how ugly it can get, right?
Exactly right. That's it. And this is where this question, do I stay Christian, is not just a theoretical question. It's because there are a lot of people who say, if that's what Christianity is going to do, I just don't want to be part of it. That's the reason they leave. But then for all of us who stay, we have a responsibility, I would say, to say, if I'm going to stay, am I going to be compliant and let all this go on unchallenged, or am I going to learn how to speak up? I have one chapter in the book called Renounce and Announce, where I'm basically saying, look, if you're going to stay, you better learn how to stay out loud and have something to say about this. Yeah. Yeah.
That's something that John and I have decided. I know John did way before I did, but this sort of concept that silence is complicity, right? It's not enough to just say, in my heart, I think this is wrong. We need to be willing to be vocal about it. It's reminiscent to me then of reading about people like in not the emerging church, but in Germany it was called the
Confessing Church.
Thank you, the Confessing Church. That word just is good. So isn't it sad that when you think of that, right, the Confessing Church in Germany during the Third Reich, you could name on one hand, the people who stood up to the Reich, and you had your Bonhoeffers, and where I've said this before, I've wondered aloud, like where is our Bonhoeffer? And I think guys like you are that for us, and I'm hopeful that your voice will be sharp like that and strong like that, and say, hey, listen, we're going to stand up against the prevailing tide here and say, no, I'm just not willing to give this up. Right? There's some level of there's at least some level of stubbornness in me that says, you're not going to take that from me too. So I might fight a little bit.
I was just at the doctor this morning because a few years ago I had melanoma. So every 6 months I have to go have a doctor check me every inch of my skin from head to toe. And anyone who's had cancer, they took a big chunk out of me when they wanted to remove that melanoma. Or if you have chemotherapy or radiation, the treatment is really harsh. And it's not because you're being mean. It's because you know how dangerous the disease is. And when I wrote this book, the first third of the book I knew was going to be tough for a lot of people to read, because I try to tell some pretty brutal truths about our history. In fact, there was one section that was so grotesque, I had to move it to the appendix because I felt it would sort of trigger people, because it's pretty ugly and grotesque, some things that have happened in the name of Christ. So But I'm glad you're saying what you're saying, Nat, because I do think we need some strong medicine right now. What's going on is pretty scary, and strong medicine is needed.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So that analogy actually really that hit home, because when you excise that disease surgically, you can't just take that, right? You sometimes take even some healthy tissue with it. Leave yourself what surgeons call margins, right? You got to have clean margins on this stuff and make sure that there's no room for that to grow back in.
That's it.
And again, whatever notion we have of going back, I don't think that's possible. I think if there's a romanticized version of a perfect Christian church that ever existed, I think we're probably wrong.
Yes.
So the only way through is forward, right?
Yes. So
there's got to be a great deal of imagination then, I think, that has to come into play, where folks can actually begin to imagine something not just different in form and function, but radically different. Like and again, not to overuse, the thinking outside the box thing, because I think it'd be more like, what box? Like there needs to be but I can see guys like you. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about you and your writing is I sense a great deal of imagination there, and an ability to see something that is maybe 2 or 3 steps down the road, that maybe we can begin to envision something that is more faithful to what we think Christ intended. And that guys like John might even get on board with something like that. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to paint you as the resident cynic. I'm just messing with you.
Yeah. Well, I do think that if the church is going to survive in any way, shape, or form, and I'm not sure it can, but if it is going to, it's going to require a lot of people like you being vocal and saying, this is the stuff that needs to change. This is the stuff that needs to not happen. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be painful for a lot of people within the church to hear. We've all been given a very, like you say in here at one point, we've all been given a very whitewashed history of Christianity, of America, of Europe, because the victors get to write the history, right?
Yes.
We need people who are saying and offering other points of view that say, okay, you need to look at different communities and look at different areas within the faith and how they were treated, or how they created a faith of their own outside of what we consider the norm. So the emerging of like the LGBTQIA churches, the ones that are affirming and specifically, have LGBTQIA people in leadership. The Black church, the overall, just the BIPOC community. And they're the ones that are saying, you need to read this other history.
Yes.
And that's where, we being middle-aged, white, cisgender, all that kind of stuff, need to kind of be quiet and listen to what they have to say and learn from them. I've learned in the last 5 years more about people outside of what I would consider, the white middle-aged people, than I ever did in school. Ever. And that's, because of the connection between faith and education and politics and all of that. And we need to start breaking down some of those walls. And if the Christian faith is going to move forward, it needs to make room for all of those people.
Yes. Well said. In fact, I used to be afraid. I was a pastor for 24 years, and I felt it was part of my job to try to save Christianity. And I've worried more in the last 15 years. I've worried more that the real danger is that Christianity will have a resurgence without dealing with its ugly blind spots. And that's why I wanted to write a book like this. If people are going to stay Christian, they better do it having faced the truth about our history and our present. And of course, I would say if they're going to stay Christian, that will then give them a chance to see the contrast between what Jesus was really about and what they're actually about. And then maybe we can find some creative ways to move forward together.
Yeah, I think that's really, really, really important that what you just said is that might be one of the more important things. Just that whole idea of not reckoning with that and somehow moving forward anyway. So as John was talking, I'm thinking about churches that have so much invested in their structure, right? These large, especially, this is another sort of example of that polarization I think that even the Christian world is very polarized right now. It seems like there's an abundance of mega churches, but they are, they're housing, 85% of the church population. It's almost like the sort of urban rural spread, right? Where you've got, there's hundreds and hundreds and thousands of small churches of less than 50 everywhere. In fact, I think at one point the average size of a church in America was around 40 or 50. But we've been led to believe that Hillsong and I don't even want to name it, but these other churches, these ginormous, the Joel Osteens of the world with their 40,000 member churches, that's the norm. And everybody that I knew as I was raised up in ministry and I was coming up, that's what we all aspired to, whether we said that out loud or not. The truth of it was every pastor I know, in somewhere in the back of their mind, they want to be on a stage in front of 10,000 people. And that's the allure, but that's also the danger, isn't it? Of getting caught into a system that now needs to be sustained and maintained. And so I noticed that those churches that I got involved with, the bigger they got, the more the questions were suppressed. Because now there's a whole lot more at stake, right? Yes,
that's right. And I just also want to say, for people, John, like you, who decide, okay, I don't really want to identify as part of this anymore, you end up having a very important role in this, because I think there's a whole lot of people inside churches. You kick out those who disagree. And so then the ones who leave, in a sense, people have to wake up and start saying, how many more people do we want to drive away? How many more people do we want to drive away? And sometimes people are willing to drive an awful lot away. But I do think, that I especially think it hits parents and grandparents when they say, gosh, we've driven away my children. We've driven away my grandchildren. And sometimes they blame the children and grandchildren. But I think in their quiet moments, they think we're not doing something right here. And that plays a role in the change that's needed as well.
20 years ago, we were asking that exact same question in the churches that I was a part of. And sadly, the focus of that questioning was what kind of programs can we offer? It wasn't a deeper examination of the things we were teaching. It was, well, how do we attract? So that became the focal point of the whole, I forget what they call it now, but that there was this movement of being more attractive to the outside,
all that.
Yeah. Thank you. Seeker sensitive. I must have got John's COVID through the microphone here because my brain is fuzzy, but that was the whole seeker sensitive model, wasn't it? Like, hey, we were less concerned about theology. We were less concerned about doctrine. And more concerned about how many programs could we offer that would entice people with families to come. And that was always the golden goose for us was, okay, you get one guy to come in, that's one. But if you get a guy with a wife and 2 or 3 small children, you could begin to build something that's generational. And so I think they were asking the right questions. I just think they were pointing them in the wrong direction. And what I'm seeing now as the pastor of a very small church, way less than 50 at this point, is that the people that I'm coming into contact with, they're not concerned with the programs. They're not interested in the next thing on your calendar. What they want to know is there something here that's authentic? Is there something here that's really worth giving your life for? Because otherwise they're about ready to kick it down the road too. And so that's my only reason for holding on is those handful of people who are there saying, listen, I'm holding on by my fingernails here. And they're desperate for something that makes sense and something that is not so narrow. And that's why a lot of times I hand copies of Generous Orthodoxy out to people as a good primer. Like, hey, this is a good place to start. Let's start to ask these. Because what I love about that book is it just asks these big, broad questions, right? There's this whole landscape that all of a sudden is open to you and you go, oh, okay, so I don't have to be this, right? And that was one of the things that I took away was that I didn't have to cast myself in this very narrow definition in order to call myself a Christian. It was very, very liberating. So I know we're here to talk about your new book, but if you haven't read A Generous Orthodoxy, I think you're missing out on one of the classic religious works of the last 100 years, personally. But what does my opinion matter, John? Well, let me ask you this then, because I know our time is short and you got a heart out. You've got more podcasts. You're doing the whirlwind tours, man. But are you going out and speaking anywhere these days? Are you pretty much just doing this kind of stuff? Or are you Or you take us on the road?
I'm not doing too much public speaking. If folks are interested, my website's brianmclaren.net, and they can find out where my speaking schedule is. But trying to get out with good people like you on these podcasts, and I hope folks will find the book to be helpful.
Yeah, well, I think they will. I sense, and again, this is just anecdotal, but I do know we had a guy on who was actually starting to collect some hard data. Who was that, John? Was that, I'll remember him later. But anyway, who actually was starting to do some actual statistical analysis of people who are going through this deconstruction, so that in 10 or 15 years, they'd have some hard data to look back on. And a lot of it had to do with people who were leaving the church, reasons they were leaving the church, those who stayed. There's a lot that he was very interested in examining. So, but anecdotally, what I feel is, there's a groundswell of people who are interested in asking some big and hard questions. And I think you're exactly right, though, that on the other side of that, there is another groundswell of people who are digging their heels in and saying, kind of not on my watch. So I don't like to usually put this in terms of fighting, but I do feel like there are fights coming. At least struggles. Let's call them struggles.
Yeah, maybe here's the way that I think we could say it that you'd feel good about. It's just to say that how every one of us chooses to live really matters. It really matters. And every one of us has to make important choices and not be silent about them. And then when we express ourselves, to try to express ourselves in what we're for and what we're committed to, rather than why other people are wrong. That's where I think we can make some progress. It won't be easy, like you say, but that's what we need.
No, but I like that. That's a great positive spin. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of our discourse these days is, all right, so what are we for? Not just what we're against. That's an easy list. What I'm against is a pretty big list. So that's fairly easy to point those out. So listen, we want to be mindful of your time, and we'll go ahead and, as much as I would love to talk to you for another hour and a half, I know you have things to do and places to go. I'm so thankful that you have been so generous with your time. Pretty good segue. No, it's really been, we've been looking forward to this for a few weeks and just excited to have you on the show. I'm excited for people to read this book. If you have not gotten the book yet, Do I Stay Christian? I would highly recommend you go out and grab it at your favorite local bookstore if you can find it. If not, then, we reluctantly recommend other places. You know where to get your books. But also make sure and check out everything that Brian has on his social media and his website. So we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. You guys can go check him out. Like I said, if you haven't heard of him before, you're in for a treat. There's a lot of material to get through. Should keep you busy for a little while. But Mr. McLaren, what an honor. Appreciate your taking the time for us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys. I look forward to getting to meet in person sometime, and keep up the great work. I've really enjoyed meeting you too, and just thrilled to know you're out there doing what you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.